Book 2, Part 1 of The Art of War by Machiavelli, translated by Henry Neville. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Clive Catterall. Book 2, Part 1. I believe that it is necessary, once the men are found, to arm them. And in wanting to do this, I believe it is necessary to examine what arms the ancients used, and from them select the best. The Romans divided their infantry into the heavily and lightly armed. The light-armed they gave the name veliti. Under this name they included all those who operated with the sling, crossbow and darts, and the greater part of them carried a helmet and a shield on the arm for their defence. These men fought outside the regular ranks and apart from the heavy armour, which was a casque that came up to the shoulders. They also carried a cuirass, which with the skirt came down to the knees, and their arms and legs were covered by shin guards and bracelets. They also carried a shield on the arm, 2 arms in length and 1 in width, which had an iron hoop on it to be able to sustain a blow, and another underneath, so that in rubbing on the ground it should not be worn out. For attacking, they had cinched to their left side a sword of 1.5 arms length, and a dagger on the right side. They carried a spear, which they called pilus, and which they hurled at the enemy at the start of the battle. These were the important Roman arms, with which they conquered the world. And although some of the ancient writers also gave them, in addition to the aforementioned arms, a shaft in the hand in the manner of a spit, I do not know how a staff can be used by one who holds a shield. For in managing it with 2 hands, it is impeded by the shield, and he cannot do anything worthwhile with 1 hand because of its heaviness. In addition to this, to combat in the ranks with the staff is useless, except in the front rank, where there is ample space to deploy the entire staff, which cannot be done in the inner ranks because the nature of the battalions, as I will tell you in their organisation, is to press its ranks continually together, as this is feared less, even though inconvenient, than for the ranks to spread further apart, where the danger is most apparent. So that all the arms which exceed 2 arms in length are useless in tight places. For if you have a staff and want to use it with both hands, and handled so that the shield should not annoy you, you cannot attack an enemy with it who is next to you. If you take it in 1 hand in order to serve yourself with the shield, you cannot pick it up except in the middle, and there remains so much of the staff in the back part that those who are behind impede you in using it. And that this is true, that the Romans did not have the staff, or having it valued it little, you will read in all the engagements noted by Titus Livius in his history, where you will see that only very rarely is mention made of the shaft. Rather, he always says that after hurling the spears, they put their hands on the sword. Therefore, I want to leave this staff and relate how much the Romans used the sword for offence, and for defence, the shield, together with the other arms mentioned above. The Greeks did not arm so heavily for defence as did the Romans, but in the offence relied more on this staff than on the sword, and especially the phalanxes of Macedonia, who carried staffs which they called sarisi, a good 10 arms in length, with which they opened the ranks of the enemy and maintained order in the phalanxes. And although other writers say they also had a shield, I do not know, for the reasons given above, how the sarisi and the shield could exist together. In addition to this, in the engagement that Paulus Emilius had with Perseus, king of Macedonia, I do not remember mention being made of shields, but only of the sarisi and the difficulty the Romans had in overcoming them. So that I conjecture that a Macedonian phalanx was nothing else than a battalion of Swiss is today, who have all their strength and power in their pikes. The Romans, in addition to the arms, ornamented the infantry with plumes, which things make the sight of an army beautiful to friends and terrible to the enemy. The arms for men on horseback in the original ancient Roman army was a round shield, and they had the head covered, but the rest of the body without armour. They had a sword and a staff with an iron point, long and thin, whence they were unable to hold the shield firm, and only make weak movements with the staff. And because they had no armour, they were exposed to wounds. Afterwards, with time, they were armed like the infantry. But the shield was much smaller and square, and the staff more solid, with 2 iron tips, so that if one side was encumbered, they could avail themselves of the other. With these arms, both for the infantry and the cavalry, my Romans occupied all the world. And it must be believed from the fruits that are observed that they were the best armed armies that ever existed. And Titus Livius in his histories gives many proofs where, in coming to the comparison with enemy armies, he says, "But the Romans were superior in virtue, kinds of arms, and discipline. And therefore I have discussed more in particular the arms of the victors than those of the losers." It appears proper to me to discuss only the present methods of arming. The infantry have for their defence a breastplate of iron, and for offence a lance 9 arm lengths long, which they call a pike, and a sword at their side, rather round in the point than sharp. This is the ordinary armament of the infantry today, for few have their arms and shins protected by armour, and no one the head. And those few carry a halberd in place of the pike, the shaft of which, as you know, is 3 arm lengths long, and has the iron attached as an axe. Among them they have 3 scopettieri, exploders or gunners, who with a burst of fire fill that office which anciently was done by slingers and bowmen. This method of arming was established by the Germans, and especially by the Swiss, who, being poor and wanting to live in freedom, were and are obliged to combat with the ambitions of princes of Germany, who were rich and could raise horses, which that people could not do because of poverty. Whence it happened that being on foot, and wanting to defend themselves from enemies who were on horseback, it behoved them to search the ancient orders and find arms which should defend them from the fury of horses. This necessity has caused them to maintain or rediscover the ancient orders, without which, as every prudent man affirms, the infantry is entirely useless. They therefore take up pikes as arms, which are most useful not only in sustaining the attacks of horses, but to overcome them. And because of the virtue of these arms and ancient orders, the Germans have assumed so much audacity that 15 or 20,000 of them would assault any great number of horse, and there have been many examples of this seen in the last 25 years. And this example of their virtue, founded on these arms and these orders, have been so powerful that after King Charles passed into Italy, every nation has imitated them, so that the Spanish armies have come into very great reputation. Cosimo said, "What method of arms do you praise more, this German one or the ancient Roman?" Fabrizio said, "The Roman, without any doubt, and I will tell you the good and the bad of one and the other. The German infantry can sustain and overcome the cavalry. They are more expeditious in marching and in organising themselves, because they are not burdened with arms. On the other hand, they are exposed to blows from near and far because of being unarmed. They are useless in land battles and in every fight where there is stalwart resistance. But the Romans sustained and overcame the cavalry, as these Germans do. They were safe from blows near and far because they were covered with armour. They were better able to attack and sustain attacks, having the shields. They could more actively in tight places avail themselves of the sword than these Germans with the pike. And even if the latter had the sword, being without a shield, they became, in such a case, equally useless. They, the Romans, could safely assault towns, having the body covered, and being able to cover it even better with the shield, so that they had no other inconvenience than the heaviness of the arms, the annoyance of having to carry them, which inconvenience they overcame by accustoming the body to hardships and inducing it to endure hard work. and you know we do not suffer from things to which we are accustomed. And you must understand this, that the infantry must be able to fight with infantry and cavalry, and those are always useless who cannot sustain the attacks of the cavalry, or if they are able to sustain them, nonetheless have fear of the infantry who are better armed and organized than they. Now, if you will consider the German and the Roman infantry, you will find in the German, as we have said, the aptitude of overcoming cavalry, but great disadvantages when fighting with an infantry organized as they are and armed as the Roman. So that there will be this advantage of the one over the other, that the Romans could overcome both the infantry and the cavalry, and the Germans only the cavalry. Cosimo said, "I would desire that you give some more particular example, so that we might understand it better." Fabrizio said, "I say thusly, that in many places in our histories you will find the Roman infantry to have defeated numberless cavalry, but you will never find them to have been defeated by men on foot because of some defect they may have had in their arms, or because of some advantage the enemy had in his. For if their manner of arming had been defective, it was necessary for them to follow one of two courses. Either, when they found one who was better armed than they, not to go on further with the conquest, or that they take up the manner of the foreigner, and leave off theirs. And since neither ensued, there follows what can be easily conjectured, that this method of arming was better than that of anyone else. This has not yet occurred with the German infantry, for it has been seen that any time they had to combat with men on foot, organized and as obstinate as they have made a bad showing, which results from the disadvantage they have in trying themselves against the arms of the enemy. When Filippo Visconti, Duke of Milan, was assaulted by 18,000 Swiss, he sent against them Count Carmignola, who was his captain at that time. This man, with 6,000 cavalry and a few infantry, went to encounter them, and coming hand to hand with them, was repulsed with very great damage. Whence Carmignola, as a prudent man, quickly recognized the power of the enemy arms, and how much they prevailed against cavalry, and the weakness of cavalry against those on foot so organized, and regrouping his forces, again went to meet the Swiss, and as they came near, he made his men-at-arms descend from their horses, and in that manner fought with them, and killed all but 3,000, who, seeing themselves consumed without having any remedy, threw their arms on the ground and surrendered. Cosimo said, "Whence arises such a disadvantage?" Fabrizio said, "I have told you a little while ago, but since you have not understood it, I will repeat it to you. The German infantry, as was said a little while ago, has almost no armour in defending itself, and uses pikes and swords for offence. They come with these arms and order of battle to meet the enemy, and, if he is well equipped with armour to defend himself, as were the men-at-arms of Carmignola who made them descend to their feet, comes with his sword and order of battle to meet him, and he has no other difficulty than to come near the Swiss until he makes contact with them with the swords, for as soon as he makes contact with them, he combats them safely. For the German cannot use the pike against the enemy who is next to him because of the length of the staff, so he must use the sword, which is useless to him as he has no armour and has to meet an enemy that is protected fully by armour. Whence whoever considers the advantage and disadvantage of one and the other will see that the one without armour has no remedy, but the one well armoured will have no difficulty in overcoming the first blow and the first passes of the pike. For in battles, as you will understand better when I have demonstrated how they are put together, the men go so that of necessity they accost each other in a way that they are attacked on the breast, and if one is killed or thrown to the ground by the pike, those on foot who remain are so numerous that they are sufficient for victory. From this there resulted that Carmignola won with such a massacre of the Swiss, and with little loss to himself. Cosimo said, "I see that those with Carmignola were men-at-arms, who, although they were on foot, were all covered with iron, and therefore could make the attempt that they made. So that I think it would be necessary to arm the infantry in the same way, if they were to make a similar attempt." Fabrizio said, "If you had remembered how I said the Romans were armed, you would not think this way. For an infantryman who has his head covered with iron, his breast protected by a cuirass and a shield, and his arms and legs with armour, is much more apt to defend himself from pikes and enter among them than as a man-at-arms on foot. I want to give you a small modern example. The Spanish infantry had descended from Sicily into the kingdom of Naples in order to go and meet Consalvo, who was besieged in Barletta by the French. They came to an encounter against Monsignor d'Aubigny with his men-at-arms and about 4,000 German infantry. The Germans, coming hand to hand with their pikes low, penetrated the ranks of the Spanish infantry, but the latter, aided by their spurs and the agility of their bodies, intermingled themselves with the Germans, so that they, the Germans, could not get near them with their swords, whence resulted the death of almost all of them and the victory of the Spaniards. Everyone knows how many German infantry were killed in the engagement at Ravenna, which resulted from the same causes, for the Spanish infantry got as close as the reach of their swords to the German infantry, and would have destroyed all of them if the German infantry had not been succoured by the French cavalry. Nonetheless, the Spaniards, pressing together, made themselves secure in that place. I conclude, therefore, that a good infantry not only is able to sustain the attack of cavalry, but does not have to fear of infantry, which, as I have said many times, proceeds from its arms, armour, and organisation or discipline. Cosimo said, "Tell us, therefore, how you would arm them." Fabrizio said, "I would take both the Roman arms and the German, and would want half to be armed as the Romans, and the other half as the Germans. For if in 6,000 infantry, as I shall explain a little later, I should have 3,000 infantry with shields like the Romans, and 2,000 pikes and 1,000 gunners like the Germans, they would be enough for me. I would place the pikes either in the front lines of the battle, or where I should fear the cavalry most, and of those with the shield and the sword, I would serve myself to back up the pikes and to win the engagement, as I will show you. So that I believe an infantry so organised should surpass any other infantry today." Cosimo said, "What you have said to us is enough as regards infantry, but as to cavalry, I desire to learn which seems the more strongly armed to you, ours or that of the ancients." Fabrizio said, "I believe in these times, with respect to saddles and stirrups not used by the ancients, one stays more securely on the horse than at that time. I believe we arm more securely, so that today one squadron of very heavily armed men-at-arms comes to be sustained with much more difficulty than was the ancient cavalry. With all of this, I judge, none the less, that no more account ought to be taken of the cavalry than was taken anciently, for, as has been said above, they have often in our times been subjected to disgrace by the infantry, armed and organised as described above. Tigranes, king of Armenia, came against the Roman army of which Lucullus was captain, with an army of 150,000 cavalry, among whom were many armed as our men-at-arms, whom they called cataphrati, while on the other side the Romans did not total more than 6,000 cavalry and 15,000 infantry, so that Tigranes, when he saw the army of the enemy, said, 'These are just about enough horsemen for an embassy.' Nonetheless, when they came to battle, he was routed, and he who writes of that battle blames those cataphrati, showing them to be useless, because he says that, having their faces covered, their vision was impaired, and they were little adept at seeing and attacking the enemy. And as they were heavily burdened by the armour, they could not regain their feet when they fell, nor in any way make use of their persons. I say, therefore, that those people or kingdoms which esteem the cavalry more than the infantry are always weaker and more exposed to complete ruin, as has been observed in Italy in our times, which has been plundered, ruined, and overrun by foreigners, not for any other fault than because they have paid little attention to the foot soldiers, and had mounted all their soldiers on horses. Cavalry ought to be used, but as a second and not the first reliance of an army, for they are necessary and most useful in undertaking reconnaissance, in overrunning and despoiling the enemy country, and to keep harassing and troubling the enemy so as to keep it continually under arms and to impede its provisions. But as to engagements and battles in the field, which are the important things in war and the object for which armies are organised, they are more useful in pursuing than in routing the enemy, and much more inferior to the foot soldiers in accomplishing the things necessary in accomplishing such defeats. Cosimo said, "But two doubts occur to me. The one, that I know that the Parthians did not engage in war except with cavalry, yet they divided the world with the Romans. The other, that I would like you to tell me how the attack of the cavalry can be sustained by the infantry, and whence arises the virtue of the latter and the weakness of the former." Fabrizio said, "Either I have told you, or I meant to tell you, that my discussion on matters of war is not going beyond the limits of Europe. Since this is so, I am not obliged to give reasons for that which is the custom in Asia. Yet I have this to say, that the army of Parthia was completely opposite to that of the Romans, as the Parthians fought entirely on horseback, and in the fighting was about confused and disrupted, and a way of fighting unstable and full of uncertainties. The Romans, it may be recalled, were almost all on foot, and fought pressed closely together, and at various times one won over the other, according as the site of the battle was open or tight. For the latter, the Romans were superior, but in the former, the Parthians, who were able to make a great trial with that army with respect to the region they had to defend, which was very open, with the sea coast 1,000 miles distant, rivers 2 or 3 days' journey apart from each other, towns likewise, and inhabitants rare. So that a Roman army, heavy and slow because of its arms and organization, could not pursue him without suffering great harm, because those who defended the country were on horses and very speedy, so that he would be in one place today and tomorrow 50 miles distant. Because of this, the Parthians were able to prevail with cavalry alone, and thus resulted the ruin of the army of Crassus and the dangers to those of Mark Antonio. But as I have said, I did not intend in this discussion of mine to speak of armies outside of Europe, and therefore I want to continue on those which the Romans and Greeks had organized in their time, and that the Germans do today. But let us come to the other question of yours, in which you desire to know what organization or what natural virtue causes the infantry to be superior to the cavalry. And I tell you first that the horses cannot go in all the places that the infantry do, because it is necessary for them either to turn back after they have come forward, or turning back to go forward, or to move from a standstill, or to stand still after moving, so that without doubt the cavalry cannot do precisely thus as the infantry. Horses cannot, after being put into disorder from some attack, return to the order of the ranks, except with difficulty, and even if the attack does not occur, the infantry rarely do this. In addition to this, it often occurs that a courageous man is mounted on a base horse, and a base man on a courageous horse, whence it must happen that this difference in courage causes disorder. Nor should anyone wonder that a knot of infantry sustains every attack of the cavalry, for the horse is a sensible animal, and knows the dangers, and goes in unwillingly. And if you would think about what forces make the horse go forward, and what keep him back, without doubt you will see that those which hold him back are greater than those which push him. For spurs make him go forward, and on the other hand, the sword and the pike retain him. So that from both ancient and modern experiences, it has been seen that a small group of infantry can be very secure from, and even eventually insuperable to, the cavalry. And if you should argue on this, that the elan with which he comes makes it more furious in hurling himself against whoever he wants to sustain his attack, and he responds less to the pike than the spur, I can say that, as soon as the horse so disposed begins to see himself at the point of being struck by the points of the pikes, either he will by himself check his gait, so that he will stop as soon as he sees himself about to be pricked by them, or being pricked by them he will turn to the right or left. If you want to make a test of this, try to run a horse against a wall, and rarely will you find one that will run into it, no matter with what elan you attempt it. Caesar, when he had to combat the Swiss in Gaul, dismounted, and made everyone dismount to their feet, and had the horses removed from the ranks, as they were more adept at fleeing than fighting. But notwithstanding these natural impediments that horses have, the captain who leads the infantry ought to select roads that have as many obstacles for horses as possible. and rarely will it happen that the men will not be able to provide for their safety from the kind of country. If one marches among hills, the location of the march should be such that you may be free from those attacks of which you may be apprehensive. And if you go on the plains, rarely will you find one that does not have crops or woods which will provide some safety for you. For every bush and embankment, even though small, breaks up that dash. And every cultivated area where there are vines and other trees impede the horses. And if you come to an engagement, the same will happen to you as when marching, because every little impediment which the horse meets causes him to lose his fury. Nonetheless, I do not want to forget to tell you one thing, that although the Romans esteemed much their own discipline and trusted very much on their own arms and armour, that if they had to select a place, either so rough to protect themselves from horses, where they could not be able to deploy their forces, or one where they had more to fear from the horses, but where they were able to spread out, they would always take the latter and leave the former. But as it is time to pass on to the training of the men, having armed this infantry according to the ancient and modern usage, we shall see what training they gave to the Romans before the infantry were led into battle. Although they were well selected and better armed, they were trained with the greatest attention, because without this training a soldier was never any good. This training consisted of 3 parts. The first, to harden the body and accustom it to endure hardships, to act faster and more dexterously. Next, to teach the use of arms. The third, to teach the trainees the observance of orders in marching as well as fighting and encamping. These are the 3 principal actions which make an army, for if an army marches and camps and fights in a regular and practical manner, the captain retains his honour even though the engagement should not have a good ending. All the ancient republics, therefore, provided such training, and both by custom and law no part was left out. They therefore trained their youth so as to make them speedy in running, dexterous in jumping, strong in driving stakes and wrestling. And these 3 qualities are almost necessary in a soldier, for speed makes him adept at occupying places before the enemy, to come upon him unexpectedly, and to pursue him when he is routed. Dexterity makes him adept at avoiding blows, jumping a ditch and climbing over an embankment. Strength makes him better to carry arms, hurl himself upon an enemy and sustain an attack. And above all, to make the body more inured to hardships, they accustom it to carry great weights. This accustoming is necessary, for in difficult expeditions it often happens that the soldier, in addition to his arms, must carry provisions for many days, and if he had not been accustomed to hard work he would not be able to do it, and hence he could neither flee from danger nor acquire a victory with fame. End of Book 2, Part 1.